The studio was laughing. Everyone was laughing. It was just another Tuesday afternoon taping of Family Feud, the kind of episode where contestants cracked jokes, Steve Harvey delivered his signature reactions, and America got its daily dose of wholesome entertainment. The lights were bright, the energy was high, and two families stood at their podiums ready to battle for cash and bragging rights. But then, in the span of 5 seconds, everything changed. Steve Harvey, mid-laugh, microphone in hand, turned to a middle-aged man named David standing at the blue podium. It was supposed to be a simple icebreaker question, the kind Steve asked 100 times before. "So David, tell me, what do you do for fun with your family?" David's smile faded. His eyes dropped to the floor. And when he looked back up, his voice cracked as he said 6 words that would stop the entire studio cold. "I haven't spoken to my son in 20 years. The laughter died instantly. The audience froze. Cameras kept rolling, but nobody moved. Steve Harvey, a man who built a career on quick comebacks and never missing a beat, stood completely still. His microphone slowly lowered to his side. For the first time in decades of hosting, Steve Harvey had no words. This is the story of what happened next. And if you think you know where this is going, you don't. Subscribe now, because what Steve did in the next 5 minutes defied every rule of television, and changed one man's life forever. 3 hours earlier, David Morrison had walked into the studio with his sister, 2 cousins, and his niece. They were the Morrison family, selected from thousands of applicants to compete on America's favorite game show. David was 52 years old, a mechanic from Ohio, and this was supposed to be a fun day. A break from routine. A chance to win some money and maybe, just maybe, get on TV doing something that didn't involve regret. But regret was all David had been carrying for 2 decades. His son, Michael, was 32 now. David hadn't seen him since he was 12. It wasn't a dramatic blowout, no screaming match or ultimatum. It was something quieter, something more insidious: divorce, distance, pride, and the slow erosion of a bond that both of them were too stubborn to repair. Years became a decade. A decade became 20 years. And now, David didn't even know if Michael would recognize him if they passed each other on the street. David's sister knew. She was the one who convinced him to apply for the show. "You need this," she'd said. "You need to do something that makes you smile again." David didn't think Family Feud would fix anything, but he agreed to go. What harm could it do? He never expected Steve Harvey to ask him about family. Back in the studio, the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Steve Harvey stood motionless, staring at David. The opposing family, the Jenkins family, stood awkwardly at their red podium, unsure whether to look away or lean in. The producers in the control room were frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but Steve didn't move. He didn't acknowledge them. His focus was entirely on David. Finally Steve spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the playful bravado that defined his public persona. 20 years? He repeated, as if needing to confirm he'd heard correctly. David nodded. 20 years. Steve stopped mid-sentence. The entire studio froze. Nobody knew it yet, but this wasn't going to be a normal episode. This was about to become something television had never seen before. Steve Harvey took a step toward David. Then another. The audience watched in stunned silence as Steve left his hosting mark, walked past the podium, and stood directly in front of David. He placed a hand on David's shoulder, and for a moment the two men just stood there. "Why?" Steve asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was genuine. It was the question of a father, not a host. David's voice broke. Pride. Anger. Time. I don't even know anymore. It just kept going. And the longer it went, the harder it was to stop. Steve nodded slowly, as if he understood something unspoken. And then he did something no one expected. He turned to the audience and spoke directly to them, not as Steve Harvey the entertainer, but as Steve Harvey the man. "How many of y'all got somebody you ain't talked to in years?" he asked. How many of y'all got a son, a daughter, a parent, a brother, a sister, and you let time just take it away from you? Hands started to rise. Slowly at first, then more. Within seconds, nearly half the audience had their hands in the air. Some were crying. Others just stared at the floor, reliving their own version of David's pain. Steve turned back to David. You got a phone? David blinked, confused. Yeah. Pull it out. David hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking. You got his number? Steve asked. I think so. I don't know if it's still good. Call him, Steve said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. David stared at Steve, then at the phone, then back at Steve. Right now. Right now. The audience collectively held its breath. Cameras zoomed in. Producers were losing their minds in the control room, but no one dared interrupt. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't planned. This was real. David's finger hovered over the screen. He scrolled through his contacts, found a name, Michael, and stared at it for what felt like forever. Then, with a trembling hand, he pressed call. The studio was silent. The dial tone echoed through the microphone Steve still held. 1 ring. 2 rings. 3. Then a voice. Hello? David's face crumpled. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Michael? There was a long pause on the other end. Dad? Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He wasn't just hosting a show anymore. He was orchestrating a moment that would ripple far beyond that studio. Steve held up a hand, signaling the cameras to keep rolling. He mouthed to the crew. Don't stop. Then he leaned in close to David and whispered. Tell him. David wiped his eyes, struggling to find words. I'm on Family Feud right now. And Steve Harvey just asked me what I do for fun with my family, and I told him I haven't talked to you in 20 years. And he told me to call you. Silence on the other end. Then, a shaky breath. You're serious? Yeah. You're calling me on national television? Yeah. Another pause. Then Michael's voice, thick with emotion. Why now? David didn't have a good answer. He didn't have an excuse. All he had was the truth. Because I'm tired, Michael. I'm tired of missing you. I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of being too proud to say I'm sorry. And I don't want to waste another 20 years. The audience was openly crying now. Even the opposing family, strangers who had no stake in this moment, were wiping their eyes. Steve Harvey stood beside David, one hand still on his shoulder, his own eyes glistening. Michael's voice cracked. I don't know if I can just forget everything. I'm not asking you to forget, David said. I'm asking if we can try. That's all. Just try. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the studio lights. Then Michael spoke again. Where are you right now? I'm in L.A. At the Family Feud studio. What hotel? David glanced at Steve, confused. Steve leaned toward the phone. I'll send a car, Steve said. You give us your address, we'll send a car to bring you here. Tonight. Who are you? Michael asked, clearly overwhelmed. This is Steve Harvey, Steve said, his voice firm but kind. And I'm telling you right now, your dad is standing in front of me, and he's trying. So the question is, are you? Another long silence. Then, send the car. The studio erupted. The audience leapt to their feet, applauding, crying, shouting. The Jenkins family rushed over from their podium and embraced the Morrisons. Even the crew members, seasoned professionals who had seen everything, were wiping their eyes. Steve turned to the camera and spoke directly to the audience at home. We're gonna take a break. And when we come back, we're not playing a game. We're witnessing a reunion. He looked back at David. You good? David nodded, unable to speak. Steve pulled him into a hug, and the two men stood there, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to something sacred. Subscribe and leave a comment. because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 2 hours later, after the taping was supposed to have ended, Michael Morrison walked into the Family Feud studio. He was escorted by a producer, past security, through the maze of hallways, and onto the stage where David was waiting. The audience was still there. Steve had asked them to stay. "This is bigger than a game show," he told them. "This is life." And they'd stayed. Every single one of them. When Michael stepped onto the stage, David stood frozen. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other, two men separated by time and pride, now standing 10 feet apart under the glare of studio lights. Steve didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just stepped back and let the moment unfold. Michael took a step forward. Then another. And then, without a word, David walked toward his son, and they met in the middle. The hug was awkward at first, stiff with 2 decades of distance. But then something broke, and David sobbed into his son's shoulder, and Michael held him like he was 12 years old again. The audience wept. The crew wept. Even Steve Harvey, a man who made millions laugh for a living, stood off to the side with tears streaming down his face. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve walked over to where his jacket was draped over a director's chair. It was a custom-tailored gray suit jacket, the kind Steve wore on every episode, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He picked it up, walked over to David and Michael, and draped it over both their shoulders. "This," Steve said, his voice steady but emotional, "is my jacket. I wear it every time I stand on this stage. And I want you to have it. Not because it's expensive. Not because it's from me. But because I want you to remember this day. I want you to remember that it's never too late. It's never too late to fix what's broken. It's never too late to say I'm sorry. It's never too late to come home." David looked at the jacket, then at Steve, then at his son. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Steve replied. "Just don't waste another day." Michael nodded, his arms still around his father. "We won't." Steve turned to the audience one last time. "Y'all just witnessed something most people never get to see. A second chance. And if you're sitting at home right now, and you got somebody you need to call, somebody you need to forgive, somebody you need to reach out to, do it. Don't wait for a TV show. Don't wait for a sign. Just do it." The audience stood and applauded for a full 3 minutes. The Jenkins family, who had come to compete, walked over and embraced the Morrisons, strangers united by a shared understanding of what it means to be human. The episode never aired the way it was supposed to. Instead, the network turned it into a special. Family Feud, the reunion, became one of the most watched episodes in the show's history. David and Michael's story was shared millions of times. And Steve Harvey's jacket, the one he gave away that day, became a symbol. David framed it in his living room. And every time someone asked about it, he told them the story. Not about winning a game show, but about winning back his son. Months later, Steve received a letter. It was from Michael. Inside was a photo of him, David, and a young boy, David's grandson, a child he'd never met. The note read, "Thank you for reminding my dad that it's never too late. And thank you for reminding me that forgiveness isn't weak. It's the strongest thing we can do." Steve kept that letter in his dressing room. And every time he walked onto the Family Feud stage after that, he thought about David and Michael. He thought about the power of a single question, a single moment, a single choice to stop running from the past and face it. Because that's what Steve Harvey learned that day. It's not about the jokes. It's not about the laughs. It's not even about the game. It's about people. It's about seeing someone in pain and choosing not to look away. It's about using whatever platform you have, big or small, to remind the world that we're all just trying to find our way back to each other. And sometimes, all it takes is someone brave enough to stop the show. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Steve Harvey walked off that stage a different man. He'd hosted thousands of episodes, made millions laugh, built an empire on entertainment. But that day taught him something he'd never forget. The most powerful thing you can do isn't make someone laugh. It's help them heal. David and Michael didn't just reconcile. They rebuilt. Slowly, carefully, one conversation at a time. And that gray jacket still hangs in David's living room, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is pick up the phone. This wasn't just television. This was life, unscripted and raw. And it proved that even in a world of noise and performance, real human connection still matters most. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten.